Welcome to the AccessTruth podcast, exploring challenging issues currently impacting missions in a rapidly changing world. The AccessTruth podcast with Paul Mack.
Well, today I'm with David Williams, Director of Training and Development with CMS, and we'll hear more about that. But welcome, David.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So through my research, I hope I have these facts correct, that you were originally from the UK and you qualified as a doctor, a medical doctor, and then changed direction, pursued theological training, were ordination in the Church of England, then got further training and in missions, and you and your wife served in Kenya, in Nairobi, for 9 years at Carlisle College. And now you've been Director for Development and Training with CMS, Church Mission Society in Melbourne, here in Australia, since 2007. You're married to Rachel, and who's also involved with you in equipping and mentoring cross-cultural workers, and you have 3 married sons. Did I get my facts right?
You nailed it completely. Well done. Great summary.
Okay. Well, those are the facts, but we're big fans of narrative and story here at AccessTruth. So I wonder if you would flesh some of those facts out with your story in your own words. Your coming to faith, how the move from medicine to theology, and then from Kenya to Australia. Would you just tell us something of your story, David?
Like many children of my generation in the UK, I went to boarding school from the age of 8 to 18 to schools that had chapel services in my primary school twice a day. So by the time I got to the top end of high school, my kind of understanding of Christianity was that God and the headmaster were kind of pretty similar figures in my mind. And if you obeyed the rules, they stayed away from you, and that was a good thing. And then God introduced into my life a Christian maths teacher in my final year at school who explained the gospel to me. And it was a remarkable experience, actually, because I've been sitting with, Bible all the way through all these chapel services. And until that moment, it was a meaningless and dusty book. But when I understood the gospel and the Lord Jesus came into my life, the Bible came alive, and it was like he walked off the pages of all these familiar stories into my life. So I arrived at medical school as a brand new baby Christian and spent the whole of my first year going to every Bible study I could lay my hands on. Had a fantastic year spiritually, not so good academically, and I had to repeat all my first year medical school exams. Which wasn't a great experience. I scratched my way through the retakes. But during that process, I was, seriously faced with the possibility of being thrown out of medical school. And I kind of thinking to myself, well, what am I going to do if I get chucked out? And kept coming back to the idea of, what I'd really like to do is teach the Bible. So having scratched my way through my first year exams and learned my mistake, and then finished the rest of my medical training without too many problems. But that little idea that what I really wanted to do was to teach the Bible never really went away. So by the time Rachel and I got married, she knew that she wasn't going to be married to a doctor for very long. So I practiced for a couple of years as a junior hospital doctor, but most of that time was applying for theological training and selection for pastoral ministry. And had a great time doing sort of undergraduate theology, assistant minister role in a local church. But then Rachel and I had always been interested in cross-cultural ministry. I think Rachel's a nurse, I was a medical student. So all our experience of cross-cultural ministry had been pretty much entirely in the medical mission space. So the idea that you could do cross-cultural mission that wasn't medical, I don't know. I mean, it sounds naive to say it, but we hadn't really thought about that. Mm-hmm. So then exploring the possibility of a Bible teaching role in cross-cultural mission came back to us. We had the great privilege of being at All Nations Christian College when Chris Wright was principal. That was a very rich and encouraging time for us. And then during our service in Kenya, we were working in a college. I was working in a college that was particularly training people for outreach and mission and evangelism. And its historic roots had been through an organization in the UK called Church Army, which was a kind of an Anglican response to the Salvation Army back in the 1800s. Okay. So kind of urban mission focused particularly on urban poverty. And the college had been founded with that focus. But of course, over time, where urban poverty is located in a city moves, it tends to move out to the outskirts. So our college had started in the 1950s in a very poor area of the city that had become sort of ordinary lower middle class. So we had the opportunity then to re-engage with informal settlement ministry in the slums in Nairobi. And we planted a classroom of our college into the middle of Kibera, which is one of the largest informal settlements in sub-Saharan Africa, and had this incredible God-shaped experience of starting theological training in the middle of a slum. And, you know, most of the things I tried to do in East Africa felt like wading through treacle, but the Center for Urban Mission, every time we got to a door, the Lord sort of opened it just in front of us in a series of remarkable ways. So it was really, truly a remarkable experience. And had the privilege then of training pastors and church leaders from across the informal settlements in Nairobi, both trying to help them to particularly, and we were doing a number of things, but helping them to see the Bible as one story fulfilled in the Lord Jesus, and to try to give them a biblical theology that would then become essentially their hermeneutic, but also helping them to think practically about how their churches could engage with the poverty of their own context with a response that was different to the prosperity theology that was all around us.
And I want to hear how then you moved from there, what brought you to Australia, but your interest in missions in those sorts of poverty-stricken contexts continued. I think you went on to do study in that area. You did your doctorate around that whole area, if I remember correctly, right?
Yeah, so I studied a Doctor of Missiology through Fuller Seminary, which was a great privilege. And my focus particularly was really around the theology of care for the poor. So I serve now with the Church Missionary Society, which has got lots of roots into Sydney Anglicanism. Probably 2/3 of our missionaries would, probably more than that, would have a strong Sydney Anglican heritage. And I was very interested to think through where do you locate a theology of care for the poor if you are reluctant to call care for the poor part of the task of mission, which would be the view that's articulated in a book like Salvation to the Ends of the Earth by Peter O'Brien and Andreas Kostenberger, which would be a key missiological text at colleges like Moore College. And so what I was trying to do is to think through, if you're skeptical about locating care for the poor as being a core of mission in the sort of holistic mission or integral mission theology, where do you locate it theologically? And I kind of explored that by interviewing Moore College faculty members and kind of asking them that question. As I then reflected on that, it seems to me that particularly in the Old Testament, the way that the poor are cared for is very striking. And I think to really unpack this, you need to have a sense of what poverty is, both in the experience of working with the poor. And I think the Old Testament gives you that category of the widow, the orphan, and the alien, who are all people who are relationally disconnected and dispossessed. So I think the Old Testament and most modern development thinking would understand poverty as a relational category with dysfunctional and broken relationships. And I think the way that the Old Testament then addresses poverty is by structuring the nation of Israel through the covenant in such a way that those who are marginalized through poverty, relationally marginalized through poverty, are then included back into community. And the community is then structured in such a way to care for them. And I think you see that same model being practiced by the early church in Acts and the epistles.
Sure.
So I then wanted to fix on the idea of the local church being that fulfillment of Old Testament Israel and having a role for caring for the poor, both in their midst and then on their margin, so that care for the poor is located in my kind of godliness as a disciple, if you like, but then in the local church's relational inclusion for those who are marginalised and broken by poverty. And just to join the dots, that was really what we were trying to do in the informal settlement ministry in the slums in Nairobi. We were trying to enable local churches to care for the poor in their congregation and in their wider community, using the resources that God had given them without resorting to a prosperity theology message.
Yeah, it's fascinating and something that's been on my personally in our mind a lot as we've come back to Australia. As I was telling you earlier, my wife and I, and just thinking about the situation, learning more about the history of what's happened here in Australia and becoming more aware of it rather than always focused out there. But so we could talk at length about that, but I want to ask you about your experience then of coming to Australia. You mentioned Sydney Anglican, and in describing your own coming here and you're coming to fulfill the role that you have, I wonder, for those who aren't from Australia, maybe those of our listeners, viewers in the US, for example, just describe the situation here in Australia with the Sydney Anglican, and where does CMS, Church Mission Society, fit into that? Yeah, would you just elaborate a little on that for us, David?
So, Sydney Anglicanism is a reformed conservative evangelical expression of Anglican theology. I think it's true that a few years back, the highest number of hits to the Gospel Coalition US website came from Sydney, Australia, until Gospel Coalition launched its own Australian version of the website. So Sydney Anglican theology would reflect that wider Gospel Coalition theological identity. Sure. And I think Sydney is remarkable in having all evangelical bishops, predominantly evangelical local churches, and a clearly evangelical theological college. That makes it very different to my own experience of Anglicanism in the UK, which was much more of a mosaic. And because of that, Sydney Anglican theology has been very influential, I think, particularly in Anglican churches around Australia, but also in the church planting movements and networks in Australia. And there's a real strength in that. And, organizations like the Australian Fellowship of Evangelical Students, AFES, would reflect that same theological clarity and passion for the gospel, generating men and women who are coming out as graduates and want to go into full-time Bible teaching ministries. And Church Missionary Society sits in all of those traditions, and then has this huge privilege of having men and women coming to offer for long-term service, who have the privilege of being well-formed through strong local churches, having done excellent ministry apprenticeships, having had great theological education. I've got 3 young adult sons. I'd be happy for them to study in any of 8 or 9 theological colleges around Australia. I mean, what an amazing privilege that is, that there's such a range of options and choices for theological education. Yeah, and so what my role is now, really, so I lead the training ministry for CMS, Church Missionary Society, and anyone who's serving long-term with our society comes to St Andrew's Hall in Melbourne for a 19-week residential intensive program that's equipping them for long-term cross-cultural mission. But all of our students have already done at least a year of Bible college, and probably the majority have done more than that, possibly, a theological degree. So I'm not having to repeat, the Bible theology subjects that have already been covered, which is a great privilege. It allows us to focus especially on missiology, anthropology, ethnography, and some of the more practical aspects of thinking about serving overseas, like how do you go about learning a language? How do you handle culture shock? Those kinds of things.
And so day to day, what does a day look like for David Williams?
A typical day would be teaching class to a group of maybe 10 to 15 adults who are all expecting to serve kind of long-term, different contexts around the world, perhaps teaching a missiology class, or perhaps teaching. Yesterday, I was teaching a 3-hour class on how you manage stress, how we deal with stress. In particular, I think transition stress, culture stress, and then the long-term stress often of living in a poverty context. There needs to be a resilience there. So trying to help people think through what their stress management strategies. That was an example of some of the practical things we're doing. Then in the afternoon, I'm often mentoring, involved in one-to-one work with our applicants, and trying to keep on top of the email mountain like the rest of us, right?
Or as I tend to do these days, ignore it. But and are you, and this will get to some of the other things I'd like to touch on with you, but you're finding there are still mainly young people here in Australia wanting to be involved, wanting to have a long-term involvement in missions. You mentioned a group there you're working with, so that sounds really positive. Yeah.
So at the moment, the current semester, we've got 15 adults. I guess our typical, if you picked a kind of classical example of a CMS trainee, they'd be in their probably early 30s or around about 30 with a young family, and they'd be saying, look, I'm committed to at least 10 years and then we'll see. Committed to going through the whole process of language learning, expecting that, the journey into mission is going to involve getting a high facility in whatever language of the country they're going to work in. And many are looking at kind of formal Bible teaching roles, whether that's in student ministry or church planting or theological education. But we've also got people using their professional skills to get into using that as a platform for ministry in more creative access countries and those kinds of things.
We'll be right back in just a moment. But first, here's a resource from AccessTruth.
I remember the early days when I first started at church. We did very little as far as reaching the rest of the world.
The missionary is a person who is supported by sending a check.
We look around the world and minimally we see thousands of what we would describe as unreached language or unreached people groups yet remaining.
So what is the challenge of global evangelism today in global missions?
The Great Commission was not given to individuals, it wasn't given to nonprofits, it was given to the church.
When we undertake something that we think is very important, we're going to take time to plan, to strategize, we're going to count the cost.
Going into areas that have never heard the gospel before with language learning and culture learning and being able to interact with cultures that have just been completely away from God for centuries.
Because discipleship isn't just making a disciple, it's making a disciple that can make another disciple.
We also need to understand that there is a pattern that we see in Scripture that actually God has laid out for us to explain us how this should happen, that we actually need to understand how God describes this pattern to us and follow what God has actually given to us as a model. Not just coming up with some great ideas on our own, but actually realizing there's a master plan that's been laid out for us.
Jesus told his disciples to go and make disciples of all nations. But how would a group so small complete a task so great? The book of Acts recalls the story of how God was at work through the early church to begin this mission. But the story hasn't finished yet. Join us as we go on a journey through the book of Acts. We'll be hearing from experienced field workers, pastors, practitioners, and follow a team through Southeast Asia to reflect on the lessons that we can learn to see what part we can play as the message of Jesus continues going global.
And now, back to the Access Truth podcast with Paul Mack.
Well, I wanted to move on to focus on a couple of articles, which is how, I got to know you and your thinking a little bit, David. I had a couple of these articles recommended through a WhatsApp group that I'm part of. But one that really caught my attention initially, you put out an article, a 4-part article through actually the Gospel Coalition magazine in 2018, I think it was, in which you proposed that pain, pleasure has replaced guilt, innocence, or is in the process perhaps of replacing guilt, innocence as an underpinning foundation for our Western secularized culture. I wonder if you'd just give us a synopsis of the introduction and the premise of your thoughts there.
Yeah. So kind of there's a few preliminary things. First thing to say is that analyzing worldviews, I think, is reasonably difficult, and analyzing your own worldview is by far the hardest part in the whole thing. If worldview is like a pair of spectacles, then your own worldview is the thing you focus through, not the thing you focus on. So analyzing our own worldview, I think, is quite difficult, but incredibly important. I think, so we're probably, I'm sure Access Truth listeners are familiar with the ideas of guilt, innocence, and honor, shame, and fear, power. I think it's important to think about those not as binary, like you're either guilt, innocence, or you're honor, shame, but rather to think about them as a sort of series of lenses that overlap, and one or possibly two might be preferenced in a particular culture. So I think that the Bible is addressing the gospel to a whole range of cultures. So you see the Bible talking about guilt and innocence and honor and shame and fear and power. And we could add all sorts of other lenses to that: purity, defilement, blessing, curse, and another emotion that you see in Genesis 3. So, guilt and shame and fear all appear in the narrative in Genesis 3, and pain appears as an emotion in Genesis 3 as well. And my thinking about all of this really came through in just teaching class at St Andrew's Hall, and one of the trainees said to me, do you really think that, our culture in Australia is really still a guilt innocence culture? I mean, he was a teacher in high school, and he, looking at his high school kids that he'd been teaching, he wasn't really seeing that. And there's been quite a number of articles noting that point, that guilt, innocence as a lens to explain secularizing Western cultures isn't really working very well. So I think Andy Crouch published an article suggesting that perhaps Western cultures are becoming more honor-shame cultures. I think the problem from a missiological point of view is that true honor-shame cultures are highly collective, family-based cultures, Asian cultures or Arab cultures. And my concern with thinking about Western cultures as true honor-shame cultures would be to argue that I think you'd have to say that we are becoming more collectivist and less individualist. And I just don't see that happening. Right. So floating the idea of pain and pleasure as being a lens through which people are making their decisions, I've kind of floated that idea, and it just seems to really resonate with people.
It does.
And as I've dug into that, really all my thinking here is completely derivative and dependent on, particularly Charles Taylor's book, A Secular Age, and Jamie Smith's, helping us to understand the secular age, and also Carl Trueman's book that just came out last year, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. Fantastically helpful. And I think, particularly Taylor is just quite difficult. I worked hard to try and get my head around some of it, and I'm not pretending to understand all of it. And I think the problem is that, particularly in our local church ministries, we need to find a way of trying to make Taylor's big ideas around secularism accessible, and to create some handles that enable people to actually put these ideas kind of into practice in local ministry. And so the pain-pleasure idea was an attempt to really try and simplify some of the ideas in the secularism narrative into something that is really easy to grab hold on. And it's really just very simply the idea that our culture is increasingly, Western secular cultures are increasingly becoming places where people are making their decisions based around what will bring them personal pleasure, over a relatively short-term period, and what will help them to avoid pain. And that kind of core worldview identity as a pleasure seeker and a pain avoider, as I've kind of shared that idea, lots of people have said to me, yeah, that resonates, that makes sense.
Totally. No, it really does. I had the same disquiet as you in hearing people try to make the point, as you said, that guilt innocence seems to apply less and less, and yet what is it moving to? And so, coming across that article really felt like it brought that together. And so I imagine you're a busy man, but if you ever want to flesh that out into a book, I'd certainly encourage you to do that, David. I thought it was very good, and I can highly recommend it if people search for you and look in either. I think the Gospel Coalition did that as a 4-part series, but then also in the CMS Checkpoint, it's a 6-part series, a little bit more fleshed out. So yeah, I can highly recommend that. And yeah, we're certainly all derivative. There's no shame in that. If we're not, then we're probably off on some unhealthy tangent. But in the second part of that series, you talk about the impact of that shift on the church with prosperity gospel. I thought those were dots well connected. But I was also thinking about if that is a shift going on and we're definitely influenced by our society and culture, what is either the current or potential impact on missions? And if the whole thrust of that is to avoid sacrifice, the sacrifice stroke love that's intrinsic in the gospel, as you point out, then surely that works against missions, right? Because it's the antithesis of all of that.
Yeah, I think that's a big challenge, and I think carrying the language of sacrifice and sacrificial service, into our recruitment and our training for mission is very important. So I've talked about as Christians trying to replace in our thinkings to say that we're not pain pleasure people, but that we're suffering and glory people. And the language in John's Gospel, Jesus's crucifixion is the moment of his glorification. So it's not simply that we suffer now in the hope of glory with Jesus in the new heaven and the new earth, but that actually for Jesus, his suffering on the cross is his glorification. So thinking about ourselves as suffering and glory people is an attempt to try and subvert or replace the pain pleasure narrative. But I think one of the really helpful things that Charles Taylor and Carl Trueman are teaching us is that if we've grown up in Western cultural contexts, we might like to think that we're not expressive individualists, but actually the end of the day, we probably are. And I think in my experience, where the rubber really hits the road on that, I think it's hard for people to make kind of sacrifices to head into mission, but it's super hard for them to think about doing that for their children. And so, that kind of idea that, the project of my life is my own personal flourishing and thriving. And that the journey that I'm on is, the journey of expressive individualism is for me to be true to myself and express who I truly am, to be authentically me. And that's what thriving and flourishing looks like. And to try to counter that narrative for ourselves is hard enough, but then to counter it for people who are taking children into mission. I sort of said as a joke to a class I was teaching recently, wonder how it would play out if CMS started a little, campaign trying to mobilize more people into mission, and, made a little tagline, you won't flourish, but Jesus will be glorified. And, the room went very quiet. So, I'm not saying that people won't flourish heading into mission. Lots of us have deeply flourished, and it's been an immense privilege. But my point is that idea that my flourishing, that's an expressive individualist idea. And what the Lord Jesus anticipates out of life in all its fullness in the trajectory in John's gospel is a life knowing him, that is a life of daily picking up your cross and following him.
I do think, while that may not be your promotions and your branding entirely, but I do think there's something in the heart of a disciple and in the experience of a disciple that should resonate, right? Like we're following the one who did sacrifice, who went to the cross. So that does, I think it should, and I do see it resonating. Whereas talking about all the benefits of, you're going to have this looked after and this looked after, and we're going to, the idea of a mission agency, we're going to take care of you and kind of cocoon you into ministry. I don't see that being effective. Whereas the call to sacrifice, even today, I think there is something that does speak to people's hearts in that.
Yeah. And I think there's an immense privilege. I counted an immense privilege to have brought up my sons in East Africa, and for them to have that opportunity to see a different worldview to the secular, humanism of a Western culture. And, that there's a depth and a richness from seeing the world through other cultural eyes. So, did they miss out on some things? For sure. But there are other very rich privileges of living and growing up cross-culturally. But, even as you listen to me saying those things, you can hear me being tempted to fall into justifying that my children flourished. And actually, that isn't every long-term gospel missionary's experience. Not everyone has flourished in that secular definition of it, and not everyone's children have. And that whole idea of sacrifice is becoming increasingly challenging, I think, in our cultural context.
It's been a real pleasure, David, and I really appreciate you taking the time. And I think these are important topics that we've touched on and are going to be very, very valuable for those who've listened. So, God's blessing on your ministry, and keep considering that book that I mentioned.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll add it to my to-do list.
Okay, there you go. Okay, well, thank you very much, brother.
Thank you so much.